Last winter, I was driving on a solo cross-country trip to a family reunion. I was supposed to make it to my friend's house, but I encountered some horrible weather. There was a massive snowstorm, which caused major traffic. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, a terrible car accident happened right in front of me, so I was stuck for quite a while. By the time I got out of the traffic, I was already 5 hours behind schedule. I was exhausted. I knew I wouldn't make it driving through the night, so I pulled into a little strip motel. I hadn't used the restroom for the entire day, and my situation was pretty urgent. The motel was obviously small and noticeably dirty, but it would work in a pinch. As I parked my car, I noticed that there was a man staring at me through the check-in window. When I walked in, I noticed that there was also a college-aged woman in the room with him too. As soon as she saw me, she asked if I was traveling alone. It kind of took me by surprise, but I nodded my head and said I was. Up until this point, the man hadn't said a word, which I thought to be strange as well. When I went to hand him my ID and credit card, he made it clear that they'd only accept cash. Red flags were going off at this point, but I was desperate and it was my only option, so I scrounged together just enough cash and he tossed me the key. As soon as I stepped inside the room, I noticed that it looked super dirty and run down. I didn't take much time to look around and rushed straight into the bathroom. When I got out, I flipped up the mattress to check for bed bugs, and sure enough, there were. It really grossed me out, and I already knew I was in for quite a night. A moment later, I spotted a cockroach that emerged from underneath the bed. If the bed bugs weren't the last straw, the cockroach was. I was out of there in a heartbeat. I decided I would use the parking space at the very least, and sleep in the back trunk hatch of my SUV. I curled up, using my suitcase as a pillow and random clothes for a blanket, and quickly fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. At some point during the night, I woke up to the sound of someone talking outside. I groggily rubbed my eyes and glanced out to see that it was the guy from check-in. He was on the phone. I looked at my watch, wondering what time it was. It was 3 a.m. It seemed a little weird, but it quickly got worse. As soon as he finished up his call, I watched as he quietly walked over to my room, unlocked the door, and walked in. The lights didn't turn on, and I sat there, completely frozen in fear and shocked. After a minute or two, he came back out, but this time, he was accompanied by another man. The second guy slammed the door shut behind him and began cursing, all while I watched in disbelief. I never saw the second guy enter, and I don't even like to think about where he was before that. They angrily talked for a moment before the check-in guy walked over to my SUV. My heart started racing, and I dropped down, quickly covering up my head with the shirt. After he tried the locked door, he peered in through the back seat, but between my tinted windows and me blending into the general mess, he didn't notice me in the hatch. The two guys walked away to the far side of the lot, as I watched the one point across the street to where a diner was. While they were distracted, I climbed up to the front seat and started my car, taking my only chance I had to get out of there. As soon as they heard my engine revving out of the parking lot, they had a look of disbelief on their faces. That adrenaline rush lasted me for the entire trip, and I drove straight there without stopping at all. Once morning came around, I called my friends back home and told them, but didn't want to worry my family, so I never mentioned anything to them. When I got back home 3 weeks later, we figured out the name of the motel thanks to Google Maps and called the police. The response left me speechless when they told me the place had closed down only days before I called. As crazy as it might sound, the bedbugs and cockroach saved my life that night. I was working the night shift at the Red Road Motel, located off of a desolate stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming. It was a small, run-down establishment with only 10 rooms, but it was the only place for miles for travelers to stay. I had been working at the motel for about a year and had grown used to the monotony of my shift. But on this particular night, it was completely different. It was about 11 p.m., and I was sitting behind the front desk, watching the heavily falling snow outside. I stared at the window in a daze until the phone rang, snapping me out of my trance. I answered, but there was no one on the other end. After saying hello several times, I assumed that there was bad reception and hung up. Immediately after hanging up, the phone rang again. This time, there was a man on the line. He introduced himself as a repairman who was being sent by the owner of the motel to fix the vending machine in the lobby. I was skeptical, as the owner had never mentioned anything about a repairman coming, but the man was insistent and said he was just a few minutes away. I agreed to let him in, and a few minutes later, a tall, burly man entered the lobby, carrying a toolbox. He introduced himself as Mike and went straight to work on the vending machine. I watched him for a few minutes while we chatted, before returning to my desk to continue my shift. Everything was quiet for a while, until I heard a blood-curdling scream coming from one of the rooms. I jumped out of my chair, wondering what could have caused such a disturbance. I cautiously approached the door of the room from where the scream had come from and listened. I heard shuffling and the sound of someone crying. I knocked on the door and asked if everything was okay, but there was no response. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should call the police, but at the same time, I didn't want to overreact. I decided to try the door, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, but the bathroom door was closed. I approached it slowly and pushed it open. To my horror, I saw a young woman, with tears streaming down her face, huddled in the corner. That's when the shower curtain ripped open and the repairman attacked me, telling me that I shouldn't have come inside. For crazy situations like these, I always keep a switchblade in my pocket. While he was on top of me punching me in the face, I pulled it out and pointed it at him. Thankfully, the knife was enough to deter the attack, and he took off and ran straight towards the parking lot. With blood dripping from my face, I turned and asked her if she was okay, but she wouldn't speak. She just kept repeating the same phrase over and over again. "He's going to kill me." I quickly called the police, and within minutes, they arrived at the motel. They searched the room and the surrounding area, but he was gone. The police questioned the woman, but she was too frightened to say much, only repeating the same phrase over and over again. They eventually took her to the hospital for evaluation, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. It wasn't until the next morning that the truth began to unravel. The police informed me that the woman was the wife of Mike, who was claiming to be the repairman. He was pulled over and arrested shortly after leaving the motel. After searching his car, the police found 10 gallons of gasoline and a large bundle of rope, which were both in the bed of his extended cab truck. Mike's wife had managed to escape their house after Mike beat her. She ran to the motel for the night to escape from him until he calmed down. When Mike arrived at the motel and found her there, he was most likely planning on doing something horrific to her. As the days passed, I couldn't help but think about the events of that night and how things could have turned out differently if I hadn't been carrying a knife. It was a terrifying and eye-opening experience, and definitely one that I will never forget. His trial is still ongoing, but I can only hope that they put him away for a long time. As I drove closer to my destination, there was a feeling of dread looming over me. I had visited my mom in the nursing home a few times already, but knowing that this would likely be the last time put an extra bit of weight in my heart. I was so lost in thought that I didn't realize how exhausted I had become until it was too late. I had to stop for the night. I found an old motel off the highway and sighed in relief when I pulled into the parking lot. It was just past 10 p.m., and by this point, I was desperate for a good night's rest. I grabbed my duffel bag, locked up my car, and made my way inside the building. The lobby was relatively modern, considering the building's age, but it seemed a bit strange. The exterior appearance looked extremely run down, with rotting wood and chipping paint, but the inside looked like a much nicer, completely different place. After checking in, the clerk gave me a room key to room 117, and I thanked him as I rushed to my room to get to bed. I opened the door and quietly closed it behind me, hoping that the noise wouldn't wake up anyone else in the motel. I flipped on the light and took a second to draw a breath. The room was incredibly clean, and the bed was surprisingly comfortable. I tossed my bag on the floor of the closet and lay down on the bed, desperate for rest and relaxation. I turned on the TV and began to adjust to the peaceful background noise. Before I knew it, I had passed out. I woke several hours later to an eerie silence. I thought about my mom and instantly started feeling upset, which caused my mind to race. I laid there for what felt like forever, trying to take my mind off of it, but it was too upsetting. I started thinking about the driving I'd have to do in a few hours, which led me to think about the game plan for the next day. I hadn't showered in over a day, and I realized that I left my bag with all the toiletries I had packed in my car. Since I was fully awake and knew I wouldn't be falling back asleep anytime soon, I decided to take a shower, so I got up to walk to my car that was parked on the side of the motel. As I made my way down the long hallway, I noticed that the lights were now flickering, which started to correlate with the eeriness of the building's exterior. Once I reached the exit and opened the door, I heard a strange noise coming from the adjacent room. It sounded like a muffled crying. I paused for a moment, and then cautiously turned around and slowly crept towards the source of the sound. I initially tried to avoid the creaking floor, but unfortunately, the motel did not seem to have floors that were much better in quality. I was definitely a little concerned, so I put my ear to the door. As soon as I did, the crying stopped. I waited a minute, and it was still silent, so I made my way out of the exit and to my car. While I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling of worry I had inside of me. Something really felt off about that room, and the entire encounter put me on edge. I retrieved my bag and walked back, and what I saw when I walked back in froze me in my steps. The door to the room was wide open, but all the lights were off inside. I peeked my head in, asking if everything was alright, but I got no response. The TV was flickering, and it provided just enough light to make out certain shapes in the room. That's when I saw it. A figure was hunched over in the corner furthest away from the door. I was already freaked out, but seeing that made everything feel 10 times worse. I asked if they were alright again, but like before, I got no response. Now that I already involved myself in the situation, I flipped on the lights to get a better look. It was a woman. As I got closer, I saw that a pillow was right next to her, covered in what seemed to be saliva. It didn't look like she was breathing, and I felt my stomach sink. Horrified, I reached in my pocket for my phone to call the police, but I realized I left it in my room. I frantically ran out of the room to the front desk, where I told the clerk. The police arrived, and ended up searching the entire motel for clues. They weren't positive yet, but they speculated that someone suffocated her with the pillow. If I had stepped inside when I first heard her, that person may be alive today, but on the other hand, I very well could have been killed too. As soon as I finished up talking to the police, I got out of there and never looked back. Thankfully, I eventually learned that the killer was caught and was sentenced to life in prison. I still can't help but feel the shame and regret in myself, knowing that I might have been able to make a difference, and ultimately chose not to.